Hey there, it's your TCC Archivist, AJ Demeter, here to talk about primary sources so you can get started using them for your research. Let's start with some definitions. The Society of American Archivists defines a primary source as material that contains first-hand accounts of events and that was created contemporaneous to those events or later recalled by an eyewitness. Another definition for primary sources from our own library research guides is information in its original form that has not been interpreted or translated. The second definition shows just how broad primary sources are. Primary sources can be lots of different things, from photographs, to letters, to oral history interviews, to physical objects. If it serves as evidence of and expresses information about people, places, things, and/or events without someone's intervention in interpreting or altering it, it can probably count as a primary source. A secondary source, on the other hand, is information that has been synthesized from multiple primary sources and other sources of information, and often makes new statements, arguments, and/or inferences from bringing these sources together. This is the bulk of what you might find in the library. Published books and periodicals that use multiple sources to make their own new information about people, places, things, and/or events. Now, there are some things that can make it difficult to tell primary sources and secondary sources apart, and in fact, there are some materials that can be both primary and secondary sources depending on the context. One of the best examples of this is newspapers, and the reason I want to discuss this is because one of the best resources in the TCC Archives is our student newspaper collection. So how can newspapers be primary sources and secondary sources? Well, when journalists write the articles in newspapers, they often use primary sources such as interviews with eyewitnesses or official documents created by a government agency, or even sometimes secondary sources such as books for historical context or subject-specific knowledge. And then they put all this information together into a piece of writing that would be considered a secondary source. However, a newspaper might also include articles where the authors themselves are eyewitnesses, or there might be letters to the editor or guest editorials expressing the author's personal opinions and perspectives. These pieces of writing would be considered primary sources. At the same time, the full newspaper, including its articles, editorials, and even its advertising, might be used as a primary source, where these components observed together form a complex information object that illustrates the time and place in which the newspaper was created. For example, a newspaper might include an article about hitchhiking, describing it as an affordable and fuel-saving form of transportation, a comic about job seekers and personal expenses, a humor column on saving on heating costs, a sports editorial on the effects of fuel shortages on Major League sports, and fast food ads that reference the economy. Together, these could paint a picture of what daily life was like living during the economic upheaval of the 1970s, which included inflation, a fuel crisis, and high unemployment. In this way, newspapers are also snapshots of a very specific moment in time, which can make them primary sources. For another example, a newspaper publishing information about a significant court case that lasts weeks or months will publish information about the case in real time as it happens over multiple issues and articles. Each issue will be a snapshot of that moment in the case, without the advanced knowledge of the case's ultimate outcome or new information revealed over its course. This example of new information being revealed over time shows us another complication of primary sources. Primary sources are often considered more reliable sources because they are closer in origin to the people, places, things, and/or events they describe. And in many ways, this is true. However, they can be just as fallible because of that proximity. So let's take that example of the court case. Primary source articles on the case as it was ongoing could imply a final verdict outcome based on factors such as the author's own assumptions and biases, the sources interviewed, or public sentiment. In this 1979 Pierce County case example, the TCC student newspaper used the accused himself as the source for most of their coverage of the case, which appears to skew the coverage in his defense. At the same time, in the newspaper's eagerness to print this story, they claimed that their interview was an exclusive, which had to be withdrawn the following issue. If you only read the first issue, however, you would continue to believe that this interview was an exclusive, as they did in that moment. This is why consulting multiple sources is always a good idea when doing research. A secondary source that was created from the available information on the full case from multiple sources would be able to tell you what the actual outcome of the case was and the important points that led to that outcome. Again, bias can also be present in this form when the author decides which points are important in their account versus which are left out, underdescribed, or even misrepresented. So both primary and secondary sources are affected by the context of their creation, their author's motives in making this work, what information was and was not available to them at that time, and other internal and external influences that might skew the information they share in their works. For example, in the context of the TCC Archives, which holds records relating to the college, a document created by the college for the general public may downplay or omit events occurring at the college that may be perceived as negative in order to protect the college's image. Archivist Robin Katz describes this issue really well. If primariness implies being closer to the truth of a person, place, thing, and/or event, then legacy building complicates primariness. The context of a primary source's creator, audience, purpose, and position in time and space will always affect its content and form. So let's look at one more example of the complex nature of primary and secondary sources and the question of their truthfulness, this time outside of the TCC archives. This famous photo shows United States President Harry Truman the morning after the 1948 presidential election he won, holding a newspaper that has the headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman." Challenger Thomas Dewey had been predicted to win, and the Chicago Daily Tribune had printed their next day's paper early before election results were finalized. So what's primary here, and what's secondary? Well, first of all, this photo itself is a primary source. It was taken during Truman's victory tour by photographer Byron Rollins, and it tells the story quite well. If you know that's Truman, you can tell that between his happy expression and the headline of his defeat, one of them is probably wrong. This image might spark questions about how long it took in 1948 to finalize election results in comparison to how we tally them now, how those results were communicated to news outlets, what it says about politics and communications that this newspaper chose to publish early. Let's climb inside the photo and explore some more. How about the newspaper? The newspaper in his hands likely contains articles that were synthesized from multiple sources and thus could be argued to be a secondary source. However, at the same time, the headline of the newspaper illustrates the incorrect early call of the election's outcome, which demonstrates this newspaper's significance as an artifact of a very specific moment in time. It's information created right at the time of the election, making it a primary source. The incorrect headline also demonstrates that just because something is a primary source does not always mean that it is truthful or accurate. With primary sources, however, even inaccurate information is information. When you explore why something is inaccurate, you learn more about the context of its creation, which is important historical information. What about Truman himself? If we had a recording of what he said at this appearance, or if we could interview him about this event, those recordings would be primary sources. If an author wrote a biography about Truman using those recordings in their research, that biography would be a secondary source. Okay, so now that we've totally complicated primary and secondary sources, let's go back to our definitions one more time. Primary sources are any kind of information object, document, photo, video, train ticket, moon rock, that contains evidence of people, places, things, and/or events, and that were created at or around the same immediate time period of those people, places, things, and/or events, or in the case of oral histories and interviews, recalled at a later date by an eyewitness. They are valuable resources because they were created close to the time they describe, so they may have more accuracy and detail about their subjects. They may also lack accuracy because of social and cultural influences, or because new information was discovered after the resource's creation. But remember, even inaccurate information is information. For example, what does a source that describes civil rights protests as rioting tell you about the culture those protesters were trying to change? Secondary sources are information objects like books and periodicals that synthesize information from multiple sources, often primary sources, to infer and create new information, arguments, and statements about a topic or topics. They are valuable resources because they pull their information from multiple sources, which helps them to confirm the accuracy of that information. They help us understand a topic from a wider view and can draw useful conclusions from the different pieces of information they have brought together, helping us form our own understandings of why and/or how historical events happen and continue to affect us. Thanks for watching. And as always, if you have any questions, reach out to the TCC Archivist at archives@takomacc.edu. Happy researching!